Oh, good evening, everyone, and welcome to House of Adonai's English Bible Study. Tonight, we're going to talk about how the Exodus from Egypt played a foundational role and defined deliverance in the Bible. You know, Israel's Exodus, moving my slides. There we go. You know, Israel's exodus from Egypt is one of the most significant events in the entire Bible. In Exodus 14:30-31, we read, "So Adonai saved Israel that day out of the hand of the Egyptians, and Israel saw the Egyptians dead on the seashore. When Israel saw the great work that Adonai did over the Egyptians, the people feared Adonai, and they believed in Adonai and in his servant Moses." This event was so important that it actually became the model for understanding God's work of salvation. And it generated multiple parallels throughout the Bible. I don't know if you guys knew that, but we're going to examine a few of these parallels together tonight. And I was very excited putting this study together because I learned quite a few things myself. One of the first parallels that we find to the Exodus model appears just one generation later when Israel crossed the Jordan. Let's compare the two. In the first Exodus, remember how Israel was encamped by the sea? We read it here in Exodus 14. It says, "Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, 'Speak to the sons of Israel, so that they turn back and encamp before Pi-hahiroth, between Migdol and the sea. You are to camp by the sea, opposite Baal-zephon.'" Now, similarly, in Joshua chapter 3, Israel was also encamped by a body of water. It was the Jordan this time, as we see in Joshua 3:1. Then Joshua rose up early in the morning, and he and the sons of Israel set out from Shittim and came to the Jordan. They lodged there before crossing over. And in the first Exodus, right before God parted the Red Sea, Moses assured Israel that Yahweh would directly intervene on their behalf. We read it here in Exodus 14. It says, "But Moses said to the people, 'Don't be afraid, stand still and see the salvation of Adonai, which he will perform for you today. You have seen the Egyptians today, but you will never see them again, ever. Adonai will fight for you while you hold your peace.'" And likewise, Joshua promised the same in before crossing the Jordan. We see in Joshua 3:5, then Joshua told the people, "Consecrate yourselves, for tomorrow Adonai will do wonders in your midst." Then, remember how God parted the Red Sea in the first Exodus? We read it here. "Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea. Adonai drove the sea back with a strong east wind throughout the night and turned the sea into dry land. So the waters were divided. Then the sons of Israel went into the midst of the sea on the dry ground, while the waters were like walls to them on their right and on their left." Well, God also parted the waters of the Jordan, as we can read in Joshua chapter 3. "So it came to pass when the people set out from their tents to cross over the Jordan, the priest came carrying the Ark of the Covenant ahead of the people. Now the Jordan overflows all its banks throughout the harvest season. But as soon as those who were carrying the ark came into the Jordan, and the feet of the priest carrying the ark dipped in the edge of the waters which were flowing down from above stood and rose up in one heap, a great distance away at Adam, the town next to Zarethan. What was flowing down to the sea of the Arabah, the salt sea, the Dead Sea, was completely cut off. So the people crossed over opposite Jericho. Yet the priest carrying the Ark of the Covenant of Adonai stood firmly on dry ground in the middle of the Jordan, while all Israel crossed over on dry ground until the entire nation had finished crossing over the Jordan. And now remember how in the first Exodus, the Passover meal was instituted as a memorial so that when future generations asked about the ritual, they would be told about how God had saved them. We read it here in Exodus 12. Now, when it happens that your children ask you, what does this ceremony mean to you? You are to say, it is the sacrifice of Adonai's Passover, because he passed over the houses of the sons of Israel in Egypt when he struck down the Egyptians, but spared our households. God also instituted a similar memorial after crossing the Jordan. God had Israel build a pile of stones as a memorial forever, so that when future generations would ask about the stones, they would be told about the miracle that God had done for them. We read about it in Joshua 4. And Joshua called the 12 men whom he had appointed from the sons of Israel, one man from each tribe. And Joshua said to them, cross over before the ark of Adonai, your God, into the middle of the Jordan, each of you. Lift up a stone on his shoulder for the number of the tribes of the sons of Israel. Let this be a sign among you. When your children ask later, saying, what do these stones mean to you? Then you will say to them, because the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the ark of the covenant of Adonai. When it crossed the Jordan, the waters of the Jordan were cut off. So these stones will be a reminder to the sons of Israel forever. You see how the crossing of the Jordan was following the pattern of the Exodus of Israel from Egypt? And there are many other such examples throughout the Old Testament, but we will look just at one more in Isaiah. In Isaiah chapter 40 to 66, Isaiah addresses Israel's captivity in Babylon. And once again, parallels to the Exodus appear. Throughout all this section, this is especially clear in chapter 43. We read, thus says Adonai, who makes a way in the sea and a path in the mighty waters, who drew out chariots and horses, and army and the warrior. They will lie down together and not rise again. They are extinguished, quenched like a wick. In these verses, God was promising to deliver Israel from Babylon. But doesn't this sound just like the Exodus? This is because Isaiah wanted his readers to see Israel's release from Babylon as another Exodus. You see, in both cases, Israel was being held captive in a foreign land and needed God's intervention to save them. Those are examples I showed from the Old Testament, and there's many others, but I want to move on to examples in the New Testament. And when we get to the New Testament, the Exodus pattern becomes even more obvious, especially in the person and in the work of Yeshua, who was a prophet like Moses. And there are just too many examples to list in this short video, but I'm going to go over just a few with you. So remember how shortly after Yeshua's birth, his parents took him to Egypt. This was to spare him from Herod's decree to kill all the young boys in Bethlehem. Let's read about it in Matthew 2. Behold, an angel of Adonai appears to Joseph in a dream, saying, get up, take the child and his mother, and flee to Egypt. Stay there until I tell you, for Herod is about to search for the child to kill him. So he got up, took the child and his mother during the night, and went to Egypt. They stayed there until Herod's death. And just 2 verses later, in verse 16, it says, and when Herod saw that he had been tricked by the Magi, he became furious, and he sent and killed all the boys in Bethlehem and in all its surrounding area, from 2 years old and under. Well, did you realize that this was a direct parallel to Pharaoh's decree to kill all the baby Hebrew boys, from which Moses was spared? Let's read about it. Exodus, it starts at Exodus 1, verse 22, the end of Exodus 1, and it goes to verse 3 of Exodus 2. It says, but Pharaoh charged all his people, saying, you are to cast every son that is born into the river, but let every daughter live. Now a man from the house of Levi took as his wife a daughter of Levi. The woman conceived and gave birth to a son. Now when she saw that he was delightful, she hid him for 3 months. But when she could no longer hide him, she took a basket of papyrus reeds, coated it with tar and pitch, put the child inside, and laid it in the reeds by the bank of the Nile. And we know what child that was, right? That was Moses. Yeshua and his family then returned from Egypt, going back to the parallels between the two, between Yeshua and the Exodus. So we said he fled to Egypt, but then we see that Yeshua and his family then returned from Egypt. And this again parallels Israel's Exodus from Egypt. Let's read about it in Matthew 2. So he stayed there in Egypt until Herod's death. This was to fulfill what was spoken by Adonai through the prophet, saying, out of Egypt I called my son. And here Matthew was quoting Hosea 11, verse 1, when he said, out of Egypt I called my son. This verse was in reference to Israel. But here in Matthew, it also applied to Yeshua. Clearly, Matthew's intent here was to draw a direct analogy between Yeshua and Israel's exodus from Egypt. And 1 chapter later, in Matthew, we see Yeshua getting baptized in Matthew 3. Then Yeshua came from the Galilee to John to be immersed by him in the Jordan. But John tried to prevent him, saying, I need to be immersed by you, and you are coming to me? But Yeshua responded, let it happen now, for in this way it is fitting for us to fulfill all righteousness. So John yielded to him. Now, did you realize that this too parallels the Exodus? It parallels Israel being immersed in the waters when they crossed the Red Sea. In Exodus 14:22, it says, the sons of Israel went into the midst of the sea on dry ground, while the waters were like walls to them on their right and on their left. Yeshua then, after the baptism, goes into the wilderness. We read about it in Matthew 4. And Yeshua was led by the Ruach into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. And after he had fasted for 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. Now, how long was Yeshua in the wilderness or in the desert? 40 days. Did you realize that this also parallels Israel's wilderness wanderings? How long was Israel in the wilderness? 40 years. Right here, it talks about in Joshua 5. For the sons of Israel walked 40 years in the wilderness until all the nations, men of war, who came out of Egypt died out because they had not listened to the voice of Adonai. And there are so many parallels between Yeshua and Exodus. Even Yeshua's famous Sermon on the Mount in Matthew 5, right? Now, when Yeshua saw the crowds, he went up on the mountain. And after he sat down, his disciples came to him, and he opened his mouth and began to teach them. This is the famous, known by some as the Beatitudes or the Sermon on the Mount. He was preaching the Torah to them, of course, but this also has its parallel with Exodus. And when Moses gave the Torah on Mount Sinai, Exodus 19, 6-8. These are the words which this is God speaking to Moses. These are the words which you are to speak to the sons of Israel. So Moses went, called for the elders of the people, and put before them all these words that Adonai had commanded him. All the people answered together and said, everything that Adonai has spoken, we will do. Isn't it amazing how many parallels exist between the two? And these parallels or allusions, they intensify as we draw closer to Yeshua's death. Look in Luke chapter 9. This is about the Transfiguration. About 8 days after these teachings, Yeshua took Peter, John, and James with him and went up the mountain to pray. While he was praying, the appearance of his face changed, and his clothing flashed like white lightning. And behold, 2 men were talking with him, Moses and Elijah. Appearing in glory, they were speaking of Yeshua's departure, which he was about to take place in Jerusalem. Now, did you know that in verse 31, when Luke wrote, they were speaking of his departure? Did you know that the English word departure was translated from the Greek word that literally means Exodus? Again, Matthew used the word Exodus intentionally to draw a direct connection or parallel between Yeshua's work on the cross and Israel's exodus from Egypt. And do you think that it was a coincidence that Yeshua's work on the cross just so happened to take place at Passover, the exact time when the Exodus began? This was definitely not a coincidence. Yeshua's death was his exodus that cleared the path for all who follow him to leave their old life of slavery behind and to enter into the promised land, eternal life. So, in conclusion, the Exodus from Egypt is not just some event that occurred thousands of years ago. It actually shapes the biblical language of deliverance. And the Exodus is still very relevant to us today, because just like for Israel, God has done a great miracle and delivered us from our slavery to sin and death through Messiah's work on the cross. In Exodus 14:31, as we saw, it says, when Israel saw the great work that Adonai did over the Egyptians, the people feared or revered Adonai, and they believed in Adonai and in his servant Moses. And so today, we too have our Exodus. If we believe and follow Yeshua, the prophet like Moses, we also can have an Exodus from death to life. Amen.